following footage will demonstrate and introduce a weaner handling system. This can be used on freshly weaned calves to re-educating older or more difficult animals. Like all animals, cattle learn. So when we handle them a certain way, we are actually training them for a response. So when handling cattle, it is important for us to reinforce the type of behaviour we want from the cattle when we handle them. Put simply, we are bunching the cattle either in a corner or at the end of the yard. We are creating a herd and teaching them that we are not a threat. When the cattle are close together and settled, we release the pressure by walking backwards 10 good steps. The cattle should stand there. After about 15 seconds, we then ask the cattle to move. Start the leaders and the rest will follow. This is the moving game, moving from one end of the yard to the other end of the yard. Someone is in the lead, just being in front, and the other person is behind the cattle, creating the flow and the movement of the herd. When you get to the other end of the yard, you then recommence the holding game. Remember, we are training the cattle, so correct position, technique, and timing are important, so that we achieve the correct response from the cattle. Repeat the holding game 3 to 4 times and the moving game 2 to 3 times. Take notice of individual cattle behaviour, the herd behaviour, and look to see if we are changing their behaviour for the better. If the cattle are not becoming settled in this time, you are doing something wrong. So put them at one end of the yard and walk away. Now that the cattle are taking direction and moving, we now make them move continuously to replicate us moving cattle in open spaces. It is very important that we set the pace of the cattle and that they walk. We must give the direction to the cattle and not allow the yards to influence the direction the cattle move. By moving the cattle continuously for 3 laps around the yard, it settles the cattle and sets them up for wanting to stand still. This then leads on to the next game of parking. When moving the cattle around the yards, make sure you get good flow and movement in your cattle. When you're ready to slow and stop the cattle, release the pressure from behind the cattle and the person in the lead will slow the lead to a stop. Now that you have slowed and stopped the cattle, they should stand there settled. You have now completed the parking game. If they do not stand still, move them around the pen for another lap. Do not ask the cattle to move off for 20 seconds if they have parked well. If it has been a big achievement for the cattle, then leave them alone for as long as possible. The reward for the cattle is them standing still. This will assist you when you are mustering and moving cattle on pastures and winter pens. We have now handled the cattle enough that their flight zone is reduced. The fact that their flight zone is now smaller means that we can put cattle between us and the yards and through the gate. Cattle with large flight zones will not want to move between us and the yards and through the gate, and if they do, they will want to do it at a gallop. This is dangerous to us and to them. Like with all movement, create the lead animals to go by being behind the point of balance. Then the rest will want to follow. Then use parallel movement to the cattle to regulate the flow and number of cattle through the gate. Parallel movement in the opposite direction to cattle will make them go forward and speed them up. Parallel movement in the same direction will slow them down and stop them. You can use this technique whenever you move cattle through gateways. Now that we have educated and trained the cattle to move around the yards and through gateways, we introduce them to the race. Cattle are very vulnerable in a race due to their confinement, so it is important to move them quietly, not touching them, and allow them to flow through the race at a walk, gaining a positive experience. Cattle which do not flow through a race and continually stop have been created by poor handling experiences and influenced by poor yard design. Use parallel movement to assist you in moving the cattle through the race only when required. If the cattle are doing what you want, leave them alone. Let the cattle enter the crush at a walk. Do not pressure the cattle wherever possible. Do not catch or restrain them. Just let them walk into and out of the crush. If the cattle are running, use slide gates or hydraulic gates on the crush to slow the cattle down. Make sure that they do not slip, fall, or get injured when exiting the crush. You can carry out the holding, moving, droving, and parking games in the backyards. This can be done on foot and on horseback. Use different parts of the yard to help you get the training result you want. When training people how to handle cattle, these are great exercises to assist them in reading cattle and how to respond correctly. If you know what your objectives are with the cattle, then you just have to work out how you are going to do it. These exercises can be carried out with 2 or 3 people. When moving around the yard, observe what the person in front of the cattle is doing and what the people behind the cattle are doing to move the cattle around the yards. The inverted T concept will assist you with your correct position as you move around the yard. Do not let the yards guide the cattle. Instead, use your position to move the cattle around the yards. If you are bouncing from corner to corner and your cattle flow is poor, change your position and increase your movement. The better the job you do in the yards, the easier it will be outside the yards. Position of everyone is absolutely critical to achieving the end result. That is why teamwork is important when working cattle in any situation. You've now seen a system to educating and training cattle in the yards. The better the job in the yards, the better the cattle will be when we let them out of the yards and handle them in the pastures. We are preconditioning the cattle for a response. So remember, we are cattle trainers. The better the job we do, the better the cattle will behave.